Are carbohydrates bad for you? From Atkins to Ketogenic, carbohydrates have been the enemy of fad diets for over 30 years. And while reducing carbohydrate intake may be beneficial for some people to help them lose weight or improve their overall health, for athletes, these types of diets are anything but healthy and can be harmful not only to short-term performance, but also to long-term health and recovery. What is it about carbohydrates that makes them so essential to athletic performance? And at the same time, what is it about low carbohydrate diets that just doesn't make sense for athletes? That's what we're going to talk about today on the Soccer Fitness video blog. Hello, I'm Richard Bucciarelli, and welcome to part one of a two-part series about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are an essential part of the diet for any and all competitive sports, including soccer. Why is this? Well, it has to do with the energy requirement of competitive sports, and soccer provides an excellent example. So before we get into it here, I've written a detailed article about this topic before, and we'll put a link to the article here and in the video description below if you'd like more information. So with that out of the way, let's talk about carbohydrates in soccer. First of all, we've got to be clear that soccer is played at a very high intensity. In fact, the average heart rate in a soccer game for elite level male and female players can be between 170 and 180 beats per minute, or equivalent to 70 to 90% of their maximum heart rate, and this is for a full 90 to 120 minutes if you include the warm-up. To put this into perspective for the average person, imagine going to the gym or going out to do a workout where you exercised for 2 hours and the entire time your heart rate stayed between 170 to 180 beats per minute. It's no wonder that soccer players need soccer fitness training to stay in shape. So exercise with heart rates that high is considered high-intensity exercise, and the energy demand, that is the speed or rate at which energy must be provided to working muscles to perform exercise, is also very high. There are only 3 possible sources of energy or macronutrients that we take into the body via the food we eat, or chemical energy, which are then converted into energy that's used to perform work, or mechanical energy. And these are 1. Carbohydrates, which are broken down and stored as glycogen and further broken down and used as glucose. 2. Fats, which are broken down and stored as triglycerides and then further broken down and used as free fatty acids. And 3. Proteins, which are broken down and stored as amino acids and only in rare cases are further broken down and converted into glucose for energy. Unfortunately, only one of these 3 macronutrients can be broken down and converted into energy fast enough to meet the energy requirements of high-intensity exercise, and that macronutrient is carbohydrates. What's the reason that carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that can be broken down quick enough? Well, when you compare a carbohydrate or glucose molecule to a fat or free fatty acid molecule, you see that the free fatty acid molecule is much bigger. And because it's bigger, it just takes more time to break down than the smaller glucose molecule does. During high-intensity exercise, when the energy demand or rate at which energy must be provided is so high, this extra time is something that the body simply doesn't have. And so the body must rely exclusively on carbohydrates to provide energy during high-intensity exercise. So let's now have a look at some recent research on carbohydrates in soccer to try to make some practical sense out of all this information. To review this initial research, I'm using the technical term glycogen because that's how it appears in the research itself. But when you hear glycogen, you can also think carbohydrates. This first graph is out of a study from the University of California, Davis, and it shows the relationship between resting muscle glycogen levels and muscle glycogen used in soccer. And as you can see, the relationship is positive. So this means that the more glycogen you have at rest or stored up, the more glycogen you then have to use when you play a sport like soccer. The next graph from the same study shows the relationship between muscle glycogen used and time to exhaustion in a soccer-specific fitness test. And again, the relationship is positive. So this means that the more glycogen you have at rest, the more you can use, and the more you can use, the longer it will take you to become exhausted in soccer. And of course, taking a longer time to reach exhaustion in soccer or in any sport is definitely a positive benefit. So exactly how much carbohydrates do athletes need to eat or include into their diet in order to optimize their energy levels? Unfortunately, another difficult thing to wrap our heads around when we talk about carbohydrate intake is that the body has a limited capacity to store carbohydrates or glycogen no matter how much of it we eat. Fat, on the other hand, has unlimited storage capacity. So, if we eat a lot of carbohydrates and we exceed our capacity to store it, all that happens is that the excess carbohydrate gets converted into fat. What this means for soccer players or any other competitive athletes is because storage is limited, once you start to train or compete, you use up some of that storage, and so you'll need to replenish it. And this replenishment needs to happen constantly, every day and in every meal of every day. Here is one more piece of evidence to try to drive this point home. And for this one, we'll think of the word glycogen as being synonymous with energy, and that is the energy that's required to perform high-intensity exercise like soccer. From a recent study out of the University of Copenhagen, researchers worked with a group of professional soccer players and then further divided them into two groups, measuring their muscle glycogen levels before and at set points after a full 90-minute soccer game. One group, represented here with the black bar, had a diet which was normal in terms of the amount of carbohydrates, and that means that it had between 40 to 50% of the total caloric intake as carbohydrates, while the other group, represented by the white bar, had a high carbohydrate diet, and that means that between 55 to 65% of the total calories came from carbohydrates. These athletes had their muscle glycogen or energy levels measured immediately before a 90-plus minute game, and as you can see, both groups had glycogen or energy levels at 100% of their storage capacity before the game. They then played a game and had their muscle glycogen again measured immediately after the game, as well as 18 hours, roughly 1 day, and 42 hours, roughly 2 days after the game, to see if there were any differences in glycogen levels from the normal carbohydrate group to the high carbohydrate group. So as you can see, both groups saw their muscle glycogen levels drop significantly, down by almost 70% immediately after the game. And that's to be expected because, of course, they used a lot of glycogen during the game itself. When the groups had their muscle glycogen levels measured 18 hours or roughly 1 day after the game, then we can see that the group with the higher carbohydrate diet actually replenished their muscle glycogen more than the group with the normal carbohydrate diet. And this trend continued in the next measurement, 42 hours, or roughly 2 days after the game, where again, you can see that the high carbohydrate group had a higher replenishment of muscle glycogen than the normal carbohydrate group. So what are the take-home messages from this landmark study on carbohydrates in soccer? Well, first of all, that a diet higher in carbohydrates is going to lead to better recovery and replenishment of energy than a diet lower in carbohydrates. And second, that even with a diet higher in carbohydrates, 2 days after a competition, you don't necessarily get full 100% replenishment of your energy. And so it's really important for coaches and players to optimally plan their training. Think periodization of training load that we talked about a few weeks ago, linked to the video here and in the description below, in order to maintain optimal energy for performance and recovery. So let's go ahead and summarize all of this information. First, sports, including soccer, are all performed at a high intensity. Second, carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that we can use to provide energy for high intensity exercise like sports. And third, a diet that is higher in carbohydrate is going to replenish energy and therefore allow athletes to recover better than a diet that is lower in carbohydrates. Next week, in part 2, we'll have a look at what the best available science says about how much carbohydrates athletes need to eat, which foods and which types of carbohydrates are best, and exactly how to plan carbohydrate intake throughout each meal, throughout each day of the week.
Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please click like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And as always, please feel free to share this video with anyone who you think may find it interesting. That's it for the blog this week. We'll see you next time, and until then, keep reaching your soccer fitness goals.